What are the most haunting deathbed confessions? Story one was an EMTB on the 911 unit that got a call about a hit and run. Cops were on scene first. The area of the city I worked in was rough. Some guy and his girlfriend had gotten into a fight in the parking lot. It ended with the guy running over his girlfriend. Needless to say, she wasn't doing well, and her vitals were tanking. We loaded her up, with a fireman and police officer joined with us in the back of the rig. She kept mumbling, "Tell my mom. Please tell my mom." And naturally, I figured it was her asking us to let her mom know she was hurt. The hospital takes care of that, and I put it out of my mind rather quickly as we were working over her. She flatlined before we arrived. They did not get her back. My partner was finishing up her paperwork, and we turned to give her wallet back to the staff. The nurse on duty, who I knew pretty well, was reading a dirty piece of paper. She looked disgusted. When I asked what was up, she simply put the piece of paperwork down. It was a letter that was picked up near her purse on scene. She had gotten accepted into a college. I realized then that in the ambulance, she was asking us to tell her mom she got into college. That is a deep sadness I have never forgotten. Story two. So this happened a couple of years ago. We had an ex-gang guy who was dying of cancer, and he confessed that he was the gang hitman for many years. He wanted to confess to all the killings and show the police where the bodies were buried. He would get closure knowing that the surviving families of his victims find out where they are buried. We had to get the hospital legal team involved because we had no policies to deal with that. Cops got involved, and the dude confessed to gang murders from decades ago. Story three. I had a patient whose memory had been fading for years. It's weird, right before a patient passes away. Sometimes they'll suddenly be doing a lot better. Anyway, he thought I was his late wife. I played along and just listened to him while he recalled his engagement, his wedding, his first childbirth, and a few other memories for me. At one point, he says, "Oh, Irene, there you are. Sorry, you know my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. Well, thank you for listening to an old man tell his stories. I hope you have great stories to tell one day, too. I'm coming, Irene." And then he passed. He was my first longtime patient. Story four. I had to tell my grandmother that dialysis would only give her another week or so to live, and it was her choice to try or not. She was in and out of consciousness at that point, and was in a clear state for the moment. She asked, "Will I pass away?" I said, "Yes." She looked me in the eye and smiled just a little and said, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." She closed her eyes, squeezed my hand, and slept until she passed a day later. When things get hard, I always hear her say, "Sometimes you gotta do what you don't want to do." Story five. Not a nurse, but my grandfather was put into a 24/7 care home with severe Parkinson's. My mom and grandma had spent 4 years basically taking care of him constantly and needed a break for a couple weeks, although visiting him every other day in shifts. I went one day alone and he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I need you to get me home so I can pass away. I can't do it here." I tried saying everything I could to the nurses and my family to get him home without saying what he told me. 24 hours later, he rushed to emerge. As he was dying, he looked at me and said, "Don't let it bother you," and passed away. Still bothers me. Story six. I'm going home. I worked as a nurse's aide in a nursing home for just 2 months, brand new. This gentleman was assigned to my caseload the entire time I had worked there and was on hospice the whole time, but had seemed to be doing well. Tonight I was working with him and he seemed off. I talked to him and explained what I was doing to care for him, but he just sounded so angry and confused. I was new to this, so I didn't know quite what to do, so I pressed on. He got so freaked out he took his oxygen tubing and tried to wrap it around my throat to strangle me. I got away, told the nurse, and was told that confusion and aggression were common when people were dying. He needed his care regardless. I went to care for him again a few hours later, and he looked so docile, so defeated. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at me and told me, "I'm really sorry for what I did earlier, ma'am. That's not who I am. I'm so sorry." I told him it was okay and that I just wanted to make him comfortable. He thanked me and said the line, "I'm going home." He just kept repeating it and sounded so urgent. "I'm going home. I'm going home. I'm going home." I thought he was still confused. He passed away 1 hour later, right after my shift was over. I was the one to hear his last words. Upon learning that he passed away, I immediately thought of those last words. Sticks with me to this day. This was almost 12 years ago, and I don't think I'll ever forget. Story 7. From when I worked in private practice. Had a patient get diagnosed with a moderately aggressive but treatable throat cancer. We tried everything we could think of to get him to consider treatment. He refused any type of treatment. So after about 3 months, his wife had their 2 adult sons basically carry him into the office at 4:50 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. I was the only nurse in the building. I got him into an exam room. Dude was completely gray, gaunt, and you could hear how close the end was every time he breathed. It wasn't exactly a death rattle, but you just knew his lungs were full of fluid. His sons sit him in a chair and he starts to slide out. The room was too small to put him on the floor, and the exam table was too high to lift him up on it. I stood between his legs and held him upright in the chair, while I told the sons to go get the doctor and told the wife to call 911. We all knew that nothing was going to keep the man alive much longer. He patted the side of my leg, it was the most he could move, and whispered, "I should have listened to you. I don't want to pass away." He lost consciousness, and all I could do was just keep him from sliding out of the chair until the MTs got there. After the ambulance got him to the hospital, he lasted about 4 hours. Story 8 looked after a guy with end-stage heart failure. He kept having episodes where if he coughed or leaned forward, anything to increase his intrathoracic pressure, he would pass out. He would come back after a few minutes and gradually go from purple back to... How long was I out for that time? He was fully mentally fine, sharp, witty, and at peace with what was going to eventually happen to him. Him and I were joking that one of these episodes was going to kill him as he sipped his tea and we talked rubbish. 5 minutes later, it happened again, and he didn't come back. He had a DNR order, which was sensible. Very eerie to talk to somebody so vibrant and alert minutes before he passed away. Such a nice dude. I want to be in that mindset when I go too. Story 9. When I was 16, I worked as a dietary aide in a pretty nice nursing home. There was this one older gentleman that I became pretty good friends with. He always talked about World War II and how he had lost so many guys in his company. Several days in a row, I had noticed that he wasn't coming down to the dining room for lunch or dinner. Went to his room to check on him, and he wasn't there. The nurse said he had a spell and fell out of his bed. His doctor wanted him to go to the hospital for observation. What had really happened is he had a stroke. He got back to the nursing home about a week later, and he really couldn't remember anyone except for me. We talked the day after he got back, and he told me he wasn't doing well. He knew his time was coming to a close, said it was time for him to pay for all the horrible things he had done when he was over in Europe. He wasn't a religious man, but he asked me where I thought he was going. I said to bed because it's getting close to lights out. He said, "No, Joe, by the way, my name is Mike. I mean up or down." Now, I'm not a deeply religious person either, but I said, "Martin, that's not for me to say." He laughed and said, "Huh, I know where I'm going. There's only one place for people who have done what I've done. I've killed so many people, Joe. Most of the time, it didn't matter who it was. We went into buildings just shooting. There's only one place for me. It's what I deserve." I had absolutely nothing to respond with. When I say that experience shook me to the core, I really mean it. That man's face is burned into memory because of that conversation. He passed away the next day. His son said he kept asking where Joe was. I quit that day. Working in a nursing home is a haunting place. Takes a special type of person to be able to watch people just pass away around you. Story 10. I didn't mean to. We were sending this middle-aged guy home after his ER visit. As soon as we moved him off the bed, he went unresponsive and had no heartbeat. We did a couple of rounds of CPR and he began to come to. He blinked a couple times, and the doctor running the code jokingly said, "Sir, you almost died on us." The man said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," in a sad way. His heart then stopped again, and we couldn't get him back. Since a lot of you are asking, it was most likely a saddle pulmonary embolism. He was there for something pretty mild, but he threw a clot right when he was being transferred. If you want to look it up, he had classic Cape cyanosis across his chest, which is indicative of a big PE. Story 11. Not a nurse, but was a cop. And I was with a 20-year-old who took his own life. He checked into a nice hotel, and his parents reported him missing. Anyways, they found out he was in a hotel by a credit card charge. I was the responding officer, and when I arrived, I knocked on the door, and he answered and was really cool. We chatted for a few minutes, and I asked him if he was willing to come downstairs to meet with his parents. He went back into his room, and I held the door open. It appeared he was putting on a jacket, but he pulled out a gun, placed it on his temple, and said, "F my family. This is on them," and pulled the trigger. First time someone mauled themselves in front of me, and wasn't the last. That crap haunts you years later. Story 12. I'm scared elderly gentleman. Worsening congestive heart failure. Incapacitated, and his wife put him on hospice. He was comfort measures only. I was at the nurse's station, and I could hear him starting to gasp for air. I walked into the room, and he was struggling to breathe. I put my stethoscope up to his back, but I already knew what was happening. His lungs were full of fluid. I sat him up in bed, and he stared at me, eyes wide open, head tilted slightly back. Facial expression was full-blown panic. I'm scared. Immediately after he said the words, his oxygen mask started filling up with pink or red frothy foam, running down his face and dripping onto his gown. He was dead within minutes, and all I could do was watch him. I will never forget his face. Story 13. This isn't something my grandma said to me, but something I said to her while she was in hospice just a few hours before she passed. She had reached a point where she couldn't speak anymore, but she could gesture a little bit. I was alone with her in her room, and my aunt and uncles, all of her kids except my dad, were chatting in the hall. I could tell she wanted something, that it was important. I just had a feeling she wanted her kids, that this was a last chance kind of thing. I poked my head into the hall and told them Grandma wanted them, and they should all come. I got brushed off and they wouldn't come a few feet into her room or stop chatting for a few minutes. I went back in and told her that everything was okay and that all of her kids were just in the next room and that everyone was here and we loved her. She seemed panicked for a moment, but then calmed down. I think she knew I was telling her it was okay to go and was accepting it. I lied to her. My dad wasn't there. He had been arrested earlier that day. We kept it from her. And I couldn't tell her that her kids couldn't be bothered to come to her. It haunts me that I had to lie to the grandmother that raised me on her deathbed. I don't think I'll ever fully forgive my aunt and uncles. She hadn't had more than 2 of her kids in the same room in 20 years, and they couldn't even let her see it happen. Story 14, I'm a hospice chaplain. Many times people begin to talk to dead family members or pets and describe them there, or see heaven opening up or things like that. I've had a good many predict their death. And one patient with ALS requested to see me, and our conversation was about how she's ready and wanted me to help her prepare. Though she seemed months from death, she passed that weekend. One story, though, takes the cake. I was working in a hospital at the time. There was a spiritual, non-religious man I had a good connection with. He requested me to his room, so I came over. He motioned me to crouch by his bed and spoke in a whisper. Do you see my brother in the corner? I told him I don't, but I believe he is seeing him. He was completely lucid and calm. As he explained, he has been in the corner and he has been talking with him, hashing things out, and coming to forgiveness like they weren't able to do before the brother died. He worried the nurses would think he's crazy and try to medicate him. When I assured him I believed him and just wanted to listen to what he had to say, he went on. I see death, too. She was in the parking lot. I could see her from my window. She had my brother with her. Now she's in the room. She's all black, but she ain't ugly. He was totally at peace. Died a few days later when a tumor invaded an artery. Story 15. I'm not a nurse, but my spouse's grandfather passed away last autumn. He was a biologist and loved nature. Before he had passed away, he had explained he had seen another dimension and how all life was connected, and told his children that he wished they would meet again as molecules in a flower. I thought these things were beautiful and reflected well on his life as someone who dedicated his time to learning about nature and its wonders. He had the most amazing life, and passing away so peacefully was a well-deserved end for a man as good as he was. Story 16. Not a nurse, but I was with 2 family members when they passed. They had sudden moments of clarity that only lasted a few seconds, but were the strangest, most religious and spiritual moments in my life. When my grandpa was dying, he was in full-blown sundowners. He wasn't coherent, couldn't really speak except in the early mornings, and was hallucinating all sorts of things like dead family members and stuff. Most of his communication was just paranoia about the nurses trying to kill him and awful stuff. I was a young teen, so my mom didn't really want me to be around him when he was like this. The last time I saw him, something clicked on in his head. It's like he fought through the cloud of unreality in his head and made direct eye contact with me and grabbed my hand. Determination, that's what's important, is all he said. But it was like he knew it was the last time he would see me. It was like someone said, all right, you've got 4 words, make them count. Immediately after that, he went back to a semi-vegetative state and mumbled. He died not long after that, and those words have pulled me through some of my toughest days. It was like the last lesson he had for me, and he had to tell me this. It took me a long time to really understand those words, but I faked it until I made it. Thanks, Grandpa. You were the best. Story 17. So, this is a little different. I am a nurse, but this happened to my grandmother. I'm not sure where I stand in terms of religion, but my grandmother was deeply religious. She had been deaf for over 70 years. She talked like a deaf person, sang like a deaf person, etc. We had her at home and she died in her bed. But 2 to 4 minutes before she passed, she sat up in bed screaming, "They're here! They're here!" with the clearest, non-deaf voice. She started singing a gospel song with the clearest, non-deaf voice. She passed about halfway through the song. I will never forget it. I have no earthly explanations for how she sang and talked so clearly at the end. I have been with many patients that have died, and usually there isn't anything that happens. They stop talking and responding long ago, and they just have the agonal breathing at the end. Nothing like when my GMA passed. Story 18. The very first patient I cared for during school was palliative. I had him for a week and my job was very minimal. Keep him company and help him drink when he wants it. I was in his room and he started saying, "There is a girl on my bed." I asked him who the girl was and he just said, "The girl sitting on the end of my bed." I didn't think much of it, just thought he was a bit confused. Went home and the next morning I happened to come in early and the nurse said to me, "Oh, you came early. Sorry to tell you, your client died yesterday after you left." It sent shivers down my body. It was like he saw a presence in his room right before he died. My teachers had told us sometimes patients would see spirits right before they died, but I didn't believe it. Story 19. Made a trip to see my dad's mom. She knew she was on the way out. She was on comfort care. We were there to say our goodbyes. I had a few moments with her before we left. Her kids stayed with her to the end. She was in her mid 80s, and her mind was still sharp as a tack. It was just her and I in the room, and I told her I loved her. She looked me right in the eyes and said, "I'm sorry this is taking so long. I think I fumbled something out about how it was okay, and we just wanted her to be comfortable." She passed away sometime after 2 a.m. that night. Two of her daughters were in the room asleep. The story I was told was that the phone in the room rang a single time, waking both daughters, and they checked on her and she was gone. The belief is that she rang that phone to let them know their watch was over. Story 20. My aunt, who was like a mother to me, was dying from cancer. We were housemates for a few years before she was diagnosed, and they were some of the best years of my life. We used to sit out on the back veranda in the evenings with a glass of red and talk about our days, life, and all kinds of other random funny crap. I don't think I have ever laughed with anyone like I laughed with her. I'm so glad I got to have that time with her. She was an amazing woman. She wanted to pass it home, amongst her family. So when we knew it was close, we all hung out at her place with her. The last time she was up and about with all of us, she got up from her chair and headed off to bed for the last time. Then she turned and looked at me and said, "Good night, love," just like she did every night when we lived together. They were her last words, and 4 days later, she passed away with all of us there in the room with her. As horrible as it all was, I felt honored to be there for her last moments. She was one hell of a human being. Story 21. When my grandma was dying, we had her at home. I stayed up with her at night to check on her and keep her comfortable. A couple days before she died, she sat bolt upright in bed, stretched out her arms, and screamed, "Daddy," in the most excited, childish voice. Her father had died in an accident when she was, I think, 5. She then laid back down and never opened her eyes or spoke again. She was gone a couple days later. I am convinced when she called out, it was because her dad came to get her. And after that, it was just a body taking time to shut off. Speaking of her dad, his last words were haunting. Back in the day, mid 30s, you could buy cans of kerosene to toss in your stove to light it. Someone had filled one with gas by mistake, and when he tossed it on the stove, the whole thing exploded. When he pushed on the screen door to get out, all of the skin on his hands stuck to the door. His last words were to the ambulance crew, "Be easy with me, boys. This is my last ride." Story 22. Not a nurse, but I lost my grandma, I was her caregiver, last year, and literally attended the funeral of my favorite grade school teacher this morning. My grandma was 96 and was hospitalized a couple weeks before her death. The night nurses would tell me they heard her talking to someone in the room, even though there was no one there. Today at the funeral I attended for my teacher who died this week at 89. The priest said she had been talking to her dead husband a lot in the days before she passed. I'm not a religious guy and don't put a lot of stock in what I can't see, but I'm starting to believe that there's something else out there, and maybe we get more in tune with it near the end. But of course, people that die when a drunk driver runs a red light or something like that probably aren't chatting with dead relatives, so who knows? Story 23. The summer of my 3rd year in nursing school, we were going to different types of hospitals to do our clinicals. We stayed at a certain type of hospital for a week or two. Our last stop was a general hospital. Mind you, this is in the rural provinces in the Philippines. On the second to last day out at that hospital, an old lady who had no family to visit her the whole time was close to going, and she looked at me while I was doing my rounds and said, "Can you stay with me a little longer and hold my hand?" I pulled up a chair and held her hand while she took her last breaths. After that, I went outside and smoked a whole pack of cigarettes and left. I never finished nursing school, and I'm just not mentally stable enough to witness things like that. Story 24. They just left me. I was visiting a male patient of mine who had been transferred to hospice across the street. He made a female friend about his age who was totally blind. The woman said she had 3 adult kids, but they didn't have time to take care of me. And it's been 5 years since my husband passed, and 5 years since my kids have visited. She would smell me when I visited my patient, and I'd spend time visiting with her. She was mentally sharp as a tack. Above all, she was kind. Almost every conversation would end with her thanking me profusely for visiting because they, her kids, just left her. In a new place, widowed, blind. Story 25. I had a client pass recently that stuck with me. She was very elderly, had various physical ailments associated with age, but still ran a tight ship. Hair and nails done. House tidy. She had been feeling unwell for weeks, just enough to be bothersome, but not bad enough for a hospitalization. She could feel the change in the wind. The day before the medics had been called, but she had been cleared to stay home. She went for coffee with her daughter. The day of, she had a lie in which was unusual for her, but was up and ready by lunchtime. She had a grumble in her refined way. "I've been through the wars." The strain was clear on her face, but she turned to the window where there was a bright blue sky and said, "Never mind that. What a beautiful day it turned out to be."